Hello again everybody, and today is the first of a series of talks to do with Hadrian's Wall, the features of it, what it was for, whether it might have achieved its purpose. So, we're going to build a wall. It's going to be a great big border wall. It's going to be the best border wall ever. Those might have been the words of an ancient emperor, or indeed a modern one. But in fact, we have no real idea of what Hadrian said about building his wall in northern England in 122 AD. What we do know is that according to an entirely unreliable ancient historian called Aelius Spartianus, Hadrian ordered a wall to be built. It was 73 miles long and it went from the west coast to the east coast. But what was it for? Well, according to Aelius Spartianus, it was to separate Romans and barbarians. Some people have said, well, it was to keep the Scots out. Well, that's wrong in lots of ways. One, it wasn't to keep anybody out, and anyway, the Scots didn't exist as a nation at that point, so that's entirely and utterly wrong. So we need to think about what Hadrian's purpose might have been in establishing this wall. We need to see this in the context of Hadrian's policy to do with walls and frontiers elsewhere in the empire. We know that he decided not to expand the empire further than it was at the beginning of his reign, because he was already running out of resources, and it was very difficult to maintain the defence of the Roman Empire as it existed up until that point. So, in the south of the empire, the border was fairly easy to establish. It was called the Sahara Desert. In the Middle East, it's a little bit more difficult and it's a little bit more fluid. And there were revolts and difficulties, as we explored in the Bar Kokhba revolt, which I talked about yesterday. In Northern Europe, it's a little easier to understand because, by and large, he was looking at the frontiers of two great rivers, the River Danube in Central Europe and the River Rhine in Northern Europe, and there's some evidence that he wanted to establish some sort of wall or defensible border fortification between the gap between the Rhine and the Danube, and this is sometimes called the Limes, and this is in Germany. And there's a certain amount of archaeological evidence about what that looked like, and there's been some recreations and explorations of experimental archaeology in modern Germany. But what about the one in northern Britain? Well, we've already established it wasn't to keep the Scots out, but according to the historian, it was to separate Romans and barbarians. What features of it might have enabled this to happen, and how do we know whether it was successful or not? Well, we do know that south of the wall, at a distance sometimes of a relatively small number of yards, sometimes maybe half a mile, there was a very large ditch which we now call the Vallum, V-A-L-L-U-M, but it had some crossing points, and these crossing points lined up with the existing crossing points when the wall was first built. These were certainly at mile castles, which occurred, as the name suggests, every mile or so along the wall. So what was the purpose of that? Well, archaeologists now suggest the most likely reason for that and the wall is to establish a military zone. The only people who would have been allowed within, between the wall and the Vallum would have been soldiers, and that would certainly have helped in separating Romans and barbarians. But it's not consistent with tribal areas. And so the idea that there's one tribe north of the wall, one tribe south of the wall, just simply didn't exist. You're driving a wall, a barrier between two parts of the existing community, and that's a real problem. Also, if you wanted to get from north to south, you didn't have to go through the wall or indeed over the wall. You might just go round the wall at either end. And I'm sure the Americans in the southern states have found similar problems, that you don't necessarily just go there, you just maybe get in a plane. What did it look like? Well, initially it was almost certainly built of turf and timber, with a big ditch on the north side, and it was gradually replaced with stone. Now, it takes a very long time to quarry stone, and it's not always easily available, so very likely that Roman soldiers, very used to digging defensive ditches and earth ramparts around temporary camps. That's certainly what they first started with. It's not going to be very dramatic looking, which later it's going to be established in stone. How big was it? Well, initially it seems that the plan was for it to be about 8 feet wide, but and certainly the foundations started to be built, but quite rapidly it was decided that was taking too much stone and taking too long, and so it was diminished to 6 feet. But there are some places where the foundations had already been built, so you've got a 6 foot wide wall on top of 8 foot wide foundations, which is quite interesting in itself. What were the other features along the wall? Well, more about those in future talks, but certainly there were mile castles. These had gates in them and places for men to stay, at least overnight. So this seems to be to do with controlling traffic between the north and the south. So rather than keeping people out, it's more about controlling things and separating potentially troublesome people and moderating how many people went north and south. There were also turrets, which were kind of lookout towers, and there was a platform along the top of the wall so that patrols could take place. There's some debate about how many forts were originally part of the wall or whether they were, but again, more about that perhaps in a future talk. So, did it succeed in separating Romans and barbarians? Perhaps, but in the same way as the wall in the southern United States. There were always ways around it or over it. It certainly made a big statement about Roman power, and the fact that we now know that it was whitewashed means that it would have been visible from a very long way away, occupying a fairly prominent position in the landscape as it does. It really makes a big statement about Roman power, and maybe that was what Hadrian wanted more than anything else, to make a big statement about his power and Roman power. But maybe it also advertises the fact that the Romans were really a little bit frightened of what was going on, and maybe modern walls do the same thing. Anyway, more on other features and the people of Hadrian's Wall in a future talk.